Imagine it's October 14th, 1873. You are a 34-year-old hardware store owner living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Your shop sits on a busy corner street, and just last spring, you took out a loan to expand your inventory because business had never been better. You have a wife, 2 children, and a small savings account at a local bank you trust completely. Every morning you walk past the same newspaper stand, the same bakery, the same faces, and every morning you believe tomorrow will look just like today. You have no idea that in 9 days, the entire financial world around you will start to come apart. Not in one single moment, but slowly, for the next 20 years. If you have ever wondered why some economic disasters do not arrive like a lightning strike, but instead grind on for a decade or more, quietly wearing down entire generations, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before in different countries, in different centuries, and it always follows a similar shape. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. 9 days after that ordinary October morning, the banking firm of J. Cook and Company collapsed. It was one of the most trusted financial institutions in the United States, the same firm that had helped finance the Civil War. When it fell, it did not fall alone. It dragged down dozens of other banks within days, and the New York Stock Exchange shut its doors for 10 straight days, the first time that had ever happened in its history. Our hardware store owner did not lose his shop in a single afternoon. That is not how this kind of collapse works. Instead, over the next several years, customers slowly stopped buying. Credit slowly dried up, prices slowly fell. And by the time he understood what was happening to him, it was already too late to do much about it. This video is about a different kind of economic disaster, not the sudden crash everyone remembers, like 1929 or 2008. This is about the slow collapse, the kind that lasts not for months, but for a full decade or longer, the kind that barely shows up in textbooks because there is no single dramatic photograph to attach to it. No soup lines stretching around the block on day one, no single bank run captured on film, just a long, slow bleeding of an entire economy, year after year, until an entire generation looks back and realizes they lived through a disaster they were never told to call by that name. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about how this type of collapse actually works underneath the surface. Think of a national economy like a large wooden ship. A sudden crash, like the one in 2008, is like the ship hitting a rock. Everyone feels the impact immediately. Everyone knows exactly when it happened. But the kind of collapse we are talking about today is different. It is more like a slow leak in the hull, far below the waterline, where nobody can see it. The ship keeps sailing. The crew keeps working. The passengers keep eating dinner in the dining hall, but water is quietly filling the lower decks, inch by inch, year after year. And by the time anyone notices the ship is sitting lower in the water than it used to, the damage has already been done for a very long time. That is the core mechanism behind a long depression. It is not one single shock. It is a chain reaction of falling prices, shrinking credit, and collapsing confidence that feeds itself in a loop, where each problem makes the next problem slightly worse for years on end. Economists have a name for the core engine of this kind of collapse. It is called deflation, which simply means prices going down across almost everything in the economy instead of up. That might sound like good news at first. Cheaper bread, cheaper rent, cheaper tools. But here is the trap hidden inside it. When prices keep falling year after year, people and businesses start to delay spending. It's because why buy something today if it will be cheaper next year? When spending slows down, businesses earn less money. When businesses earn less money, they cannot pay back the loans they took out earlier when prices were higher. Banks then become afraid to lend because they are worried borrowers cannot repay them. And when banks stop lending, businesses cannot expand. Workers get fewer hours and spending falls even further. It becomes a wheel that spins in the wrong direction, and once it starts spinning, it is very difficult to stop. This wheel is the secret key to understanding almost every long economic collapse in modern history. And once you see it, you will start noticing it everywhere. This brings us directly to the first great example of this pattern, and it is the one almost nobody talks about, even though it happened in the most powerful economy on earth at the time. After J. Cook and Company collapsed in September of 1873, the United States entered what was then called the Long Depression, a name almost forgotten today because the 1930s collapse later stole that title. But the numbers from the 1870s are staggering. By some estimates, 18,000 businesses failed across the United States between 1873 and 1879. Unemployment in some American cities reached as high as 25%. Railroad construction, which had been the engine of American growth for a decade, fell by nearly half. And here is the part that surprises most people. This was not a 2-year recession. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, The contraction lasted 65 months, making it, at the time, the longest economic downturn ever recorded in the United States, a record that stood until the 1930s. For the ordinary person living through it, there was no single headline event after the bank failures of 1873. There was just a long, gray stretch of years where wages kept falling, where farmers in the Midwest watched crop prices collapse because of a worldwide glut of wheat and silver, and where small business owners, like our hardware store owner from Philadelphia, watched their customer base shrink a little more every single year. Some historians estimate it took until the early 1880s for industrial production to fully recover, and certain sectors, like railroads, did not stabilize until the 1890s. That means a child born the year Jay Cooke and Company collapsed could have grown into a teenager before the economy their parents remembered ever truly came back. What made this so dangerous was not the size of the shock. It was the length of it. A sudden crash gives people a clear villain and a clear before and after. A long depression gives people nothing to point at. There is no single day to blame. There's just a slow erosion that makes people start to believe this is simply how the world works now, that this lower, harder standard of living is permanent. And that psychological shift, the quiet abandonment of hope for recovery, is in many ways more dangerous than the economic numbers themselves, because it changes how an entire generation makes decisions, how much they save, how many children they have, how much risk they are willing to take for the rest of their lives. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. If a collapse does not announce itself with a single dramatic day, like a stock market crash on the news, how would you even know you were living through one? Would you notice it happening to your own town, your own job, your own savings, while it was still happening? Or would you only realize it 10 years later, looking back? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, think about it. Because what I am about to show you next is a case where an entire country tried desperately to fight this slow collapse using a tool everyone believed would save them, and instead it became one of the most studied disasters in economic history. And it changes how you will think about every promise a government makes during hard times. This leads to the second part of this story, and it takes us to Japan in 1991. For nearly 3 decades before that year, Japan had been the envy of the entire world. Its economy grew so fast after World War II that people called it an economic miracle. By the late 1980s, Japanese real estate prices had become so inflated, meaning pumped up far beyond their real value like a balloon stretched right to the point of bursting, that the land underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was, on paper, worth more than the entire state of California. That is not an exaggeration. That is a documented comparison economists made at the time to illustrate just how detached prices had become from reality. The Nikkei stock index hit a peak of 38,957 points on December 29th, 1989. Then it started falling, and it kept falling, with small recoveries scattered in between for the next 20 years. The technical recession that began around 1991 is now widely remembered as the start of what economists call Japan's lost decade. Except history was not finished writing that name, because that lost decade eventually became 2, and by some measures, nearly 3. Picture an ordinary Japanese salary worker, what the Japanese call a salaryman, in his late 30s in Tokyo in 1991. He bought a modest apartment in 1989 at the peak of the bubble, taking out a mortgage that assumed property values would keep climbing the way they always had during his entire working life. Within 3 years, that same apartment was worth 40% less than what he paid for it. And while his mortgage payment stayed exactly the same, he was not unemployed. He still went to work every single day. He still had a salary, but he was trapped paying off a debt larger than the actual value of his own home, a condition economists call being underwater, like trying to swim while wearing an anchor. Japan's banks, weighed down by trillions of yen in bad loans tied to inflated property, became extremely cautious about lending money, which slowed the entire economy, which made prices fall further, which made the debts feel even heavier, even though the actual numbers on paper never changed. This is the same wheel we described earlier in the foundation of this video, just spinning in a different country, with different currency, decades later. What makes Japan especially important to study is that the government did not sit by passively. They tried enormous spending programs to stimulate the economy. They cut interest rates again and again until they essentially reached zero, a policy almost nobody had attempted at that scale before. And still, the deflationary wheel kept spinning for years, in some respects for decades. Japan's nominal GDP, which is the total size of its economy, measured in plain yen without adjusting for inflation, was roughly similar in the early 2010s to where it had been around 1991, meaning 2 full decades of essentially flat economic growth in a major industrial nation. And now, look at what connects this to the American Long Depression of the 1870s. Different country, different century, different currency, but the same underlying engine: Asset prices, whether that is railroad stock in the 1870s or real estate in Japan, become inflated far beyond their real worth. The bubble eventually bursts. Debt that was taken out when prices were high does not shrink along with the falling prices. And the entire economy gets trapped in a slow-motion squeeze that can last not for months, but for 10, 15, even 20 years. Most people will never know what you now know after hearing these two stories side by side. Most people believe an economic collapse is something that happens, gets reported on the news for a few weeks, and then ends. If you are still here, watching closely, comparing these patterns across decades and continents, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks, the part where we look at a collapse so severe and so prolonged that it actually helped bring down an entire empire. The third case study takes us to the final years of the Soviet Union, and then into the chaos that followed its breakup in 1991. While the Soviet collapse is often remembered as a single political event, the actual economic disaster surrounding it stretched across more than a decade. Throughout the 1980s, the Soviet economy had been propped up by an unsustainable mix of high oil prices and enormous military spending. When global oil prices fell sharply in the mid-1980s, a key source of government revenue disappeared, and the entire economic structure, already weakened by decades of inefficiency, began to crack. When the Soviet Union officially dissolved in December of 1991, the successor nations, most importantly Russia, were thrown into one of the most brutal economic transitions of the 20th century. Russia's gross domestic product, the total value of everything the country produces in a year, is estimated to have shrunk by as much as 40% between 1990 and the late 1990s. To put that into perspective, the United States during the Great Depression of the 1930s saw its economy shrink by roughly 30%. Russia's collapse in the 1990s was, by some measures, even deeper, and it lasted for the better part of a decade before any real stabilization began. Picture a retired schoolteacher in Moscow in 1992, a woman who had spent 40 years teaching children who had been promised a state pension that would let her live comfortably for the rest of her life. The promise was built on the value of the Soviet ruble. When hyperinflation hit Russia in the early 1990s, with prices in some years rising by over 2,000%,